Hello and a big welcome to Research Live. Today we discuss on gender dynamics in the higher education sector, and we're pleased to have Professor Julia Buckingham, Vice-Chancellor and President of Brunel University, London. Professor Buckingham has rich experience in supporting schemes to promote gender equality in higher education. Examples of this include the Rural Scheme and the Athena Swan Charter. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and welcome to Research Live, Professor Buckingham.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward very much to our conversation.
How do you think gender stereotypes might affect academic career development?
I think that's a good question, but I don't think it's so much about gender stereotypes. I think it's perhaps because people don't really understand the differences between men and women, and we are very different, and the way in which we behave and the different challenges we have at different stages of our life, and particularly the difficult challenges that women have around the time they're having children, when the load of responsibility on them and the change in lifestyle is absolutely devastating. But men and women do behave differently. There's a lot of evidence now that women, for example, are better team players. And there's a lot of evidence now that boards work better if they've got a mixture, and it's not just men and women, it's a mixture of people from different backgrounds, different ethnicity, etc. All of these things are very important. But I do think it's about understanding, not so much about stereotyping.
So why do you think this is happening?
Why do I think it's happening? Well, as I said at the beginning, I think there are fundamental differences in the biology of men and women. So I really genuinely don't believe that there has ever been any campaign against women in academia or indeed anywhere else. I think it is a lack of understanding the way in which we need to support women in the work environment. And part of that is because when you think historically, women are fairly new in the work environment. So people have had to learn, both men and women, have had to learn how to work together and how to ensure that everybody can realise their potential. And I think we've still got a long, long way to go to really understand how we can best develop women's careers and ensure that they have all the opportunities that they need to have. We've done a lot, we've come an enormous way in the last 10 or 15 years, but we've still got a huge amount to do, and we've got to focus on doing it.
To go back a bit to numbers now, I mean, recent data show that only 17% of the higher education institutions in the UK are led by female VCs, which you are one of them, and it's a fantastic achievement, of course. You are also the first one here at Brunel University, London. Now, I would like you to kind of take us back through your journey and share with us some example of gender-specific issues, if you had any or you perceived any in your career.
Well, I went to an all-girls school, and I think actually that's probably a privilege, while I think many people think it's not a privilege, because we do know statistically that as a scientist, women are more likely to study physics, chemistry and biology at A level if they go to an all-girls school. So I suppose I had a slightly competitive advantage to start with. But that said, my school wasn't very scientific. And when I went off to university to read science rather than medicine, having turned my place down to do medicine, there was shock and horror that I could possibly go off and do that. So there was a lot of surprise. But I think when I was young, I didn't really think about a career very much. I went to university because I was genuinely interested in biological science and I wanted to learn more about it. I went into industry because I wanted not to stay in a university. In fact, I remember saying I didn't want to go into a university ever again in my life when I left university, so there you go. Never know what's going to happen to you. And I went into industry, but actually I didn't like industry very much, and I realised, I think that was when I began to realise that I was probably quite ambitious, because I realised it would be very difficult to develop a satisfying, what would be to me a satisfying career in industry without having a PhD. So I spent my time in industry looking around for the PhD that I wanted to do with the supervisor that I wanted to work with, and that was very, very important to me. And I think, you know, luck always has a part in all of our lives, and I don't think any of us could possibly deny that. I was extremely lucky in that I went into a very supportive environment, and an environment with great humour. I remember in my PhD interview, my supervisor-to-be asked me if I was married, engaged or pregnant. And, you know, these days people would be absolutely shocked. In those days that was par for the course. It didn't worry me, I just thought it was a bit of a joke and laughed and said no such luck. That's why I want to do a PhD. And I got the job. And I think having a sense of humour actually is incredibly important, and I would recommend that to everybody. As soon as you start taking yourself too seriously, I think that's not a good place to be in. So I think for me it was a natural progression, but I suspect part of it is being on the right track, but I think part of it's in your genes, and part of it is have you actually got that inherent ambition and that inherent drive to want to move forward. And not everybody's got it, and not everybody wants to have it. It's not right for everyone. Going back to your original question, there aren't very many female VCs. Well, no, there aren't, because when I went to university, only about 10–15% of the population at university was female. So I think actually the fact we've got 17% of VCs as women, well done us women, haven't we done well? And you do need to look at things in context of the generation. Now, if in 20 years' time we are still in the same position, then something is really, really wrong, because the percentage of women going to university increased hugely about 10 years after I went to university. And it's now, of course, gone up exponentially, and we're now in a situation, which is very interesting, where more women are going to university than men. More women are coming out with better degrees than men. So, in theory, when this cohort reach my level, it should be way more than 50% of VCs who are female.
Any ideas of what you think could be done to further promote or to make this possible?
Well, I think, as I said, I still think the key stage is around the time that women have children. To succeed in academia, you've got to have a very good research track record. So you've got to be pulling in grants, you've got to be writing high-quality papers, you've got to be training good PhD students who go into good jobs, and you need to be able to demonstrate that. You've got to be buzzing around the world, going to conferences to talk about your work, and I always remember my old prof used to say to me, you've got to get your face out in front of the buggers. He had lovely English. And that's really important, because people, yes, they do read things, but they remember you when they've seen you, and getting out and going to conferences is really important. You've got to engage with the external community. You've got to get yourself on external committees. So you've got to start developing those leadership skills very, very early in your life. It's no use staying in your lab and focusing exclusively on your research. You've got to get out. At the same time, you've got to develop your teaching portfolio. You've got to have a rounded career. It's no use focusing exclusively on research. You've got to get that balance between teaching and research. So it's a hugely big call on someone who at the same time is going through probably the most stressful, in inverted commas, time of their life, having young children when their life at home is completely turned upside down. So I think we've got to think much, much harder about the support we can put in for young women, and indeed young men when their wives are having children, to ensure that they can get through that difficult stage. And that means keeping their research career on track, because the moment you aren't pulling in grants, and the moment you aren't writing papers, and the moment your research group begins to shrink down to a small number, then you are on the downward spiral, and it is really, really difficult to get back in. So I think one of the key things that we have to do is to make sure that we are doing much, much more to support young people at that stage, and that's what I want our next Athena Swan strategy to focus on. I want to see us doing much, much more to keep those active young people active during that difficult time. So that does mean reducing their teaching load when they come back from maternity leave, but it also means putting financial support in place to make sure they've got support to do their research, because you can't do it on your own. You've got to have a team. If you're not leading a team, you're not going to progress. So I think all those things are very important. The hows are difficult because it's expensive, and as you know, higher education is facing a more difficult period now with the comprehensive spending review coming up. But we have to find a way of helping talented young women. I doubt we can help everyone because the numbers are huge, but we've got to find a way of doing something.
Last summer,
Mhm.
Professor Tim Hans made some comments about the trouble with girls in the lab. How you perceive his comment?
Well, my initial reaction was that I was pretty cross. But before I went around shouting that I was very cross, I actually went back and looked at the context in which he said it. And actually the context in which he said it was very different. And I think the press played a hugely irresponsible game in that by actually taking what he said completely out of context and making a big song and dance about it. What he was actually talking about was basic biology. So I think the press often do. It was a good story. It ran for, in my view, far, far too long. And it was unfortunate. I think it was also unfortunate that a lot of people behaved very precipitately at the time. And I think it's one of those occasions, it's a bit like having an email that you don't like. It is better not to respond to it and just go away and calm down.
And I guess that leads to an earlier point that you were making, that we need to put ourselves out there. And doing that obviously could be challenged. For example, when we take Professor Hans' case, he was out there putting his work, and then it led to a comment that was, taken over for the press. Given your experience, what advice would you give to up-and-coming researchers or academics in general when we are putting ourselves out there? What are the cautions we need to take?
Well, I think it depends on the context in which you are going out and talking about your work. If you're going out and talking to, and I'm talking about science now, if you're going out and talking to a scientific community, you're going to say your professional body to give a lecture, then you talk in very, very hard science. But I think when you're engaging with the public, I think people need a lot of training. I think many people find it very, very difficult to talk about their specialist subject in a very, very simple, straightforward way. And it's like teaching. You need a lot of training to teach. It's not just a question of breezing into a classroom and getting on with it. You need a lot of training. And I think, again, this is something where, for those people who want to talk to the media, and I think public engagement in science is tremendously important. That's why I do so much work with the Royal Institution, because I think the work they're doing is absolutely fantastic. But people do need to be trained. And they need to be trained by professionals, because you always need to be careful when you're talking to people who are not immediately professionally in your field. It's very easy for them to misunderstand things, to take things out of context. So you need to be very, very clear in the way in which you communicate. So practice makes perfect, I suspect, but none of us are perfect.
I'd like to go back into the Athena's one you just mentioned and the new focus that Brunel, you would like to steer Brunel towards. And what are the other existing tools, mainly for early career researcher and academics?
Well, I think there are different things needed at different stages of development, but I think perhaps the most important starting point is to try and understand what individual people really want. Because, as I said, not everybody wants to progress right the way through. It's not their ambition, and we shouldn't be making them do it any more than not every man wants to do it. So it has to be tailored, I think, very much around the individual. But I think we also have to explain very clearly to individuals what they need to do to progress to the next hurdle. So another thing that we've put in place in Brunel is the personal development review, which will happen annually. And that, to me, is incredibly important, because this is the time to sit down with your line manager and talk about your work and talk about what you need to do to get to the next stage and how you're going to go about managing that. And that, I think, also helps people to see how their career might develop. And it might be that you say to the individual, look, let's imagine they're a lecturer now. Your next stage is to be a senior lecturer. Well, this is what the criteria are to be a senior lecturer. This is what you've done so far. So these are the things you really need to focus on for the next year or 2 years, however long you're talking about, to reach that hurdle. Come back and talk to me, and then we'll work on your CV, we'll work on taking it forward, and then we will know when is a sensible time for you to go forward for promotion. And what I am concerned about is, at the moment, a lot of people, male and female in the university, are turned down for promotion, and that worries me. And that suggests to me that they are coming forward too early for promotion. and that's not helpful to anyone. And as I said, women actually, because they're more cautious, tend to do very well in promotion, so actually that doesn't affect them. But I think the other thing we have to look at is actually the criteria we use for promotion. And you will all be very aware that for a long time in the university sector, research has been the principal focus for promotion. And it's been driven, of course, by the RAE and then REF, which have been very, very powerful, and I genuinely believe that the RAE and REF have raised the quality and the volume of research in the UK, and I think it's been a very, very good thing, even though it's a lot of hard work. But the downside of RAE and REF is that teaching has not been seen as such an important activity by some people in the university. And this is appalling, because universities are centres of education and research, and they're not one or the other, they are both. And a very important part of our role is to educate our students. We've all had the privilege of going through university and being educated. It is our turn to educate the next generation. So we do need to make sure that our promotion criteria reflect the holistic roles that people play in the university. Of course, research is very important, but we must also fairly and objectively reflect people's contribution to teaching and teaching scholarship and teaching leadership. So we are at the moment reviewing the promotion criteria to ensure that we can encompass people's overall contribution. And we have to recognise that different people do different things. Some people will be more research focused, some people will be more education focused, and some people are channeling up the middle. And we need a process whereby the promotions criteria are tailored to people with different balances of interests, so everybody has the opportunity to go forward, because we can't all do everything. It's simply not possible. There aren't enough hours in the day, so we have to be reasonable. So Bill Leahy is leading on that at the moment, and I hope that we can bring that in very soon.
Thank you. And what about the coaching system on a larger scale, like UK-based, like the Aurora program, in which we are part?
Yes.
So would they improve the leadership and the promotion also path?
Well, I think the Aurora programme, it's on its second year now, as you know, and we've actually got quite a number of people going through. I think time will tell, of course, how successful it's been. It's a little bit premature. But I believe very strongly in mentoring, and I think what's really come out of the Aurora programme is the mentoring. But it's also formed a network of people who are talking to one another, supporting one another, and hopefully encouraging one another. And I think, again, that's something as a university we aren't very good at doing. And I'd like us to see actually much broader networks of women across the university, because the people in the Aurora programme are all very much at the same stage of development. And I've had a couple of lunches with them which have been absolutely great, but I would like to see more women from across the university involved in those lunches, and actually some men as well, because this isn't an exclusive club, to talk to people and again talk about their experiences and how they've progressed through their careers. I think we can do more around the Athena Swan lecture, and we had a wonderful lecture last week. It was absolutely fantastic. But actually last week, or the week before last now, time goes so quickly, I went to Strathclyde and did their Athena lecture. And the way in which they did the art, but they had an afternoon, which also I think is a good thing to do. But they had, after I'd given my talk, they had 4 people, women at different stages of their career. 2 had just reached professorship and 2 were more junior, talking about their experiences and how they were managing things. And then they had someone from Edinburgh, from the Department of Chemistry, who had led very successfully their application for an Athena Gold Award, and talked about the work that had been done in Edinburgh to get them to that stage. And it was an absolute great afternoon. We had a huge discussion, not just wonderful science, we also had a huge discussion about the different things and the different mechanisms that different universities are putting in place to help women take their careers forward. And I've been talking to Lorraine about this, because I think next year we can do something similar in the university. But we need to talk to the women in the university and find out what they would like. I mean, do you necessarily want to have a lecture from a very successful woman at a later stage in her career, or would you prefer it was all more junior people? Do you want a mix? Do you want people who've had successful careers in completely different spheres of work coming in and telling you about the challenges that they have? I mean, I sit on something called the Women in Leadership Forum, I think it's called, which is linked to the National Centre for Universities and Business. And it's chaired by Rona Fairhead, who is the chairman of the BBC. And there are two academic women on this committee. One is Julia King, who is the Vice-Chancellor at Aston, and the other is me. And everybody else is drawn from industry, commerce, etc. And for me, it's been an absolutely fascinating experience because I've spent most of my life in academia, so most of the women I interact with are women academics, apart from in my home life, which is different. But what was interesting about being in this environment was that the women who came from the non-academic sector, their whole raison d'etre was power. It's very, very interesting. I've not come across that in a group of women before. It was how they moved from one leadership position to another leadership position to another leadership position. And we had a very interesting discussion about how in academia, the early stages of your career are actually about me, my CV, my research, my teaching, my this, not how am I getting myself into a position of leadership where I am leading a group, leading a department, leading a program, taking on positions of responsibility, etc., etc. And you may perhaps begin to link that to what I keep saying about how we need to develop leadership skills in people. It's not simply about putting your head in a burrow and doing your research and getting good publications, etc. That's all terribly important. But you've got to do much, much more. And we've got to get people into leadership positions. Not necessarily in the way that people do in the private sector, because that's different. But that's what those ambitious women are doing. And one of them said she came back from maternity leave and she was actually leading quite a big group. She was in HR. She was leading quite a big group in HR. And her line manager, I'm sure with the best intentions of the world, said perhaps you don't want to go for promotion immediately because you've got the complications of looking after your family and you might like a sort of slightly more comfortable life for 6 months. She said, over my dead body, I want to move up to the next level. I want more power. And it was actually, I would say, it was all a surprise to me because I have not been in that sort of context before. And I think it's not a very university context, but also translating it into the university, I don't think we think nearly enough about developing leadership skills in people at a very early stage in their career. And I think that can be to the detriment of people beneath them because maybe they're not getting the right mentoring, the right leadership as they progress through their careers. So that's why I keep rattling on about how important it is to develop leadership skills. And actually, when I first became pro-rector at Imperial, which is about 8 years ago now, and I realised I was sitting in the senior management team with some very experienced people from outside of the university sector, having to deal with things like the university's finance and the legal stuff and all that sort of stuff, thinking, I haven't got this background, how am I going to acquire it? And talking to my then line manager and agreeing with him that I should take some time out and go off to the London Business School and learn something about business management, which is exactly what I did, which was great. And again, I was the only academic, and I was thrown into a group of people whose aims and aspirations were, again, very focused around leadership, general management, understanding how you run an organisation, which was very, very interesting. And I'd like to see that sort of thing happening to people at a much, much younger stage of their career. So they can open their eyes. They might say, no, that's not for me, hate it, don't want to go there, and that's fine. But it's actually giving them that opportunity to see what's out there.